Welcome to Awards Heaven podcast. I've got a really special guest today. I've got Nick Spake, who has written two volumes of this amazing book that I'm desperate to talk about today. Nick, welcome.
Hey, thank you, Rob. It's great to be here.
Talk us through, mate, what these books are about. First of all, the subject matter, and then I want to get into what drew you to want to write about this subject.
Yeah. Well, so far we've got two volumes of what's going to be a three-volume set, and it's called Bright and Shiny, A History of Animation at Award Shows. And the title is self-explanatory enough. It's all about animation and how the medium has been represented at award shows throughout history, not just at the Oscars, although that's a major part. It's also just as much about animation at the Emmys, animation at the Annie Awards, which is specifically for animation. And we also get into BAFTAs, Golden Globes, so on, and just discussing how it's represented at these award shows and why the medium really deserves more recognition. And one of the reasons that I wanted to write this book was because, quite frankly, animation we all know gets the short end of the stick when it comes to awards. So I figured, well, this will be a pretty short book to write about. But the more research I did and the more interviews I did, I found that there was a lot more to the story than I thought. And I thought it was best just to go back to the very beginning when the Academy introduced an Oscar for Best Animated Short, which was the fifth year, and just go from there. And when you do that, you'll find that there's a lot more than you might anticipate, especially when I started interviewing more people. Overall, I interviewed about 200 industry professionals, not just about the Oscars and how they went there, but also about just their experiences making a lot of these shows and movies that we talk about in the book. So, in addition to inside baseball about the Oscars and Emmys and Annies, you're also going to get a lot of behind the scenes stories about how these movies and shows were made and why they are deserving of recognition from organizations like the Academy.
Yeah, I'm curious when you embark on a project like this, what is the number one challenge? Is it finding a publisher? Is it pitching this idea to someone who will come along for the journey with you?
Yeah, well, I guess, the biggest challenge was both researching and just also figuring out what exactly the book is going to be, because I knew from the beginning that I wanted to talk about the Oscars. But the more research I did, I thought, well, maybe I could expand it to the Emmys and Annies. And that's where I really needed to do digging, because even though there's a fair deal out there about the Oscars, but there's never been a book about the Annie Awards, so I pretty much had to start from square one there, talking to a lot of people who had worked on it, as well as going into newspaper archives. And with the Emmys, a lot of people just assume that for years The Simpsons won, and while that is true, there is more to the story than that. So,
Mhm.
research was the biggest thing. In terms of getting a publisher, with most cases, that would be the hardest challenge with any book. And I lucked out because I reached out to Bear Manor Media, which specializes in entertainment books, especially ones that sometimes deal with more niche subject matter, and are also open to publishing in volumes. So they were pretty quick to get on board with doing the book. And I had actually already written the book by the time that I reached out because I knew that whether or not I could ever get this published, I needed to get it on paper. And by the time that I had reached out, it was basically going to be more than one book. I knew that much, and that most publishers would probably want me to narrow it down, which I was willing to do. I was willing to compromise. But since Bear Manor Media was open to doing this in three volumes, I was all on board with them.
Wow, it just sounds like such a massive undertaking. And I just think if I put myself in your shoes, I would always be wondering about how much pushback do you get from interview subjects and people that you are asking questions with as part of your research, because in the beginning you don't really have much to show for it, and so you are asking for a lot of people to take a gamble or to just give you a chance, give you a shot. Did you find the early stages of trying to build all this stuff, all this material, like particularly difficult because of that?
Yeah, to an extent. When I first started writing it, I thought that I would mainly just go off archived material, interviews that already exist. And I realized that in order to really get into the nitty gritty and make this book its own, I needed to conduct my own interviews for it. So I figured, well, maybe I'll reach out to a couple animation historians and that'll be the end of it. Maybe some animators will be interested. And surprisingly, a lot of people were actually interested in getting on board. I think the first person I ever interviewed was Nancy Beeman, who is a Disney animator going back to the Renaissance days and even in the 80s and so forth, kind of back when, it was going through a regime change there. And I found that a lot of these animators and people who have worked on these films and shows are on social media. So really, I just had to reach out through Facebook. And while some never got back to me, others were actually pretty interested in talking, some through email, and I think it helped that I conducted a lot of these during the pandemic when a lot of more people had free time. And yeah, and I would also use Rocket Reach, which is a you can use to get emails from people. So that also helped. So a lot of people were surprisingly on board. I didn't get everyone that I would have wanted, but I did manage to get at least one person from each project that I wanted to do a deep dive into.
That's fantastic. Who would you say would be probably the biggest name or names that you're able to get on board?
Well, probably the most surprising was I got Alan Menken and Stephen Schwartz to come on and talk at the same time. Yeah, they were collaborating on Disenchantment around that time, so I was able to get them both at the same time. And originally, I reached out to Stephen Schwartz, and his assistant got back to me saying, "I see you haven't talked to Alan Menken either. Do you want to talk to him too?" I'm like, yeah. And I didn't really believe that was going to materialize until they were both on a Zoom call.
Look, that is so exciting. I remember when I interviewed Alan Menken once. I was I don't get really starstruck very often, but as you probably know, Nick, I'm really interested in talking to composers, and so who better than someone like Alan Menken, you know? And I was I can imagine that you probably would have been in the same boat. I'm very excited to talk to someone about caliber.
Yeah, and they were in Alan's office where he actually has most of his awards on like a mantle in the background. And they landed on the subject about how Alan has a Razzie for the movie Newsies, which in turn would go on to win him a Tony. And Stephen Schwartz was really impressed that he actually had a Razzie. Like, oh, I didn't know you had a Razzie. So it kind of goes to show that having a Razzie these days actually gives you street cred.
I think so. Remember when Sandra Bullock won the Razzie and the Oscar, I think, in the same year? I think that's true, unless I dreamt that up. But
Yeah.
I sometimes have a real problem with the Razzies because I feel like, oh, you're being too mean. But then every once in a while, I can see that if you're a good sport and you don't take yourself too seriously, it actually could be quite a fun thing to receive, I guess. So,
Yeah. And we also get into the Razzies too in the book. There aren't a ton of animated films to talk in there, but there are a few.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Let's move on to what the first volume covers because you go way back to Walt Disney's first Oscar, all the way to The Lion King. Speaking of Alan Menken, The Lion King's release. So, talk me through the highlights of the first volume.
Yeah, so it all starts with Walt Disney's first Academy Award, which was for The Short Flowers and Trees, which was not only the first animated film ever to be recognized, but also the first in Technicolor, which Disney had a copyright on for a period. He could only he could exclusively use that, which really helped him on the awards trail, seeing how people were using a inferior two strip or in black and white at the time. So Disney pretty much swept all those years. And then we get more into Disney's competition, the Max Fleischers, the Looney Tunes at Warner Brothers, Tom and Jerry, which went on to sweep around the same time that Disney was focusing less on shorts and more on features like Snow White. And we also get into Snow White, of course, and how that only got one competitive nomination, but would get an honorary Oscar, which was unveiled by Shirley Temple, who asked Walt Disney, "Isn't it bright and shiny?" which is where the title of the book comes from. And beyond Disney features, we also get into why there was such a long delay in getting a Best Animated Feature category, because there were two people who really were on board with doing that, and that was Bill Littlejohn, who was a legendary animator. He worked on, for many studios going back to the Golden Age, and June Foray, who was the voice of many animated characters, most notably Rocky the Flying Squirrel, and they were both Academy members. They not only fought to make sure that they kept the short categories at a time where a lot of people were saying that they were outdated, but were also saying there should be a category for feature animation. But the mentality was, well, there's only one, really. And they weren't entirely wrong. Disney was dominating, although there were some other milestones back then, too. We get into other animated features that were recognized, like Don Bluth's An American Tail, and as well as a few that didn't get recognition from the Academy, but probably should have, like animators like Ralph Bakshi, who showed that animation could be explicitly for adults with films like Fritz the Cat. But we also get into the 90s Renaissance when Beauty and the Beast finally broke into the Best Picture race, showing that, yes, an animated film can contend against something like Silence of the Lambs, as well as other films that followed, like Aladdin and The Lion King, which some people thought might get into Best Picture after it won a Golden Globe, but it didn't materialize. And Volume 1 ends there, which was kind of at a turning point in animation because it was becoming clear that we probably weren't going to get another animated film in a while that was going to replicate the same success that Beauty and the Beast had, yet people still weren't sure whether or not there would be a category for animated feature. And over the next several years, that would change. And that's around the time that Volume 2 goes into.
Before we move on to Volume 2, I'm fascinated about Beauty and the Beast because I think that was 1992 when I'm 91, one of those. And I remember, I mean, it's a long time ago now, and I was much, much younger as you were. Uh, when just this, the whole idea of having an animated feature in Best Picture, back then there were only five, is such an amazing achievement. And it really rocked the industry. As you say, it really gave animated features, I think, that credibility that they perhaps didn't quite have before. It ended up winning score and song, like most of that golden age of Disney in the 90s were winning at the Oscars. Um, and I always think back on that and just think about how incredible and how difficult it was for that film to make it into the top five. What are your thoughts on Beauty and the Beast and how critical and pivotal it is to the history of animation at the Oscars and in Hollywood generally?
Yeah, well, if you're going to have a first animated feature nominated for Best Picture, Beauty and the Beast is definitely a great selection. And I think one of the reasons that film was finally able to break through, like no other film had, is that Disney really went all in on getting it a Best Picture nomination. They played it an unfinished version at the New York Film Festival. And as we all know, film festivals are very integral to generating awards buzz. And they really committed to that. And after they won the Golden Globe for Best Picture, Musical, or Comedy, which was the first time that had ever happened, it became a real sign that this just might go all the way. And it did. Although there were several signs that it wasn't going to win. And for starters, there was some pushback from the acting branch. On that telecast, you could see people like Shirley MacLaine and Eliza Minnelli commenting about how they should get together and make a movie with some real actors. Even though Beauty and the Beast had real actors, even ones that were household names like Angela Lansbury, and it really wouldn't be until Robin Williams the following year that people realized, oh, big names can be in animated films, and as we would see later, they can also equal big paychecks. So even though the actors branch has gone on board with animation, I still don't know if they respect it in the same vein, seeing how we still haven't seen a voiceover performance nominated. And part of that's because actors like to see their faces, even though they're constantly getting awarded for films where they wear a ton of makeup, which is kind of a double standard, I think. And also, we've yet to see an animated film nominated in Best Director. And I interviewed the directors of Beauty and the Beast, and one of them, Kirk Wise, said, the most common question that I get is, what does an animation director do? And he said, the same thing that a live action director does. We're responsible for all the same creative decisions. We're just working in a different medium. And he doesn't think that people really recognize that. And even though animation directors can join the directing branch of the Academy, they still aren't welcome into the DGA, which is a pretty crucial predecessor award in getting recognition at the Oscars. So it is just really baffling that we still don't have animation directors in the DGA. They can go to the Animation Guild, but I don't understand why they couldn't possibly go to both or get to choose between one or the other.
Wow, you learn something every day because actually did not know that, and that is fascinating. I mean, it actually explains a lot. And until they're allowed into the DGA, I feel like they're just never really going to have parity. I remember the actors during that time pushing back on Beauty and the Beast, like it was some controversy that the actors were going to be out of work. Like, where were they going to get the voices from? Like, there was no AI back then. I don't understand the problem. These days, that is no longer the case. I think animation acting is absolutely respected and admired. We've now moved on to motion capture and a whole other bunch of things that have come out of, I think, voiceover, traditional voiceover over the decades. But so that brings me to this question. You move on to volume two, where you start to look at the animated feature category. That was a huge, huge change for the Oscars and a really welcome one. I remember when it was announced that most of the reaction was very positive. Do you agree?
Yeah, I do think that it was largely positive, although there were some people in the industry who were saying, well, does this mean we're never going to have an animated film nominated in Best Picture again? And at the time, it seemed like that might be the case because there were still only five nominees. It's since expanded to 10, and we have seen two more get in there, although it's still exceedingly rare. Maybe that's partially because of the animated feature category, but I also think that at that point you couldn't afford not to have an animated feature category because it wasn't just Disney anymore. We had seen Pixar, which was sure under the Disney umbrella, but at the time there was no guarantee they were going to stay together. There was DreamWorks, which did win the first Best Animated Feature Oscar with Shrek. There was a surplus of international animation with Studio Ghibli. There was more independent animation, and in the following years, there were more animation giants here in the States, like we have Illumination now. We have just so much more animation than general. This year alone, we had 35 submissions in animated feature, as well as a few that surprisingly weren't even submitted. So it's no longer a challenge to have a real race in animated feature. So at that point, I think that even the people who were critical about having that category relented, saying it is a good for recognition, and I'm glad they have it overall.
Yeah, when Shrek won, it was so ironic given Disney's dominance over the years. Yeah, I just thought that was a really cool thing for the Academy to do. Honestly, now if I ever watch Shrek these days, I can see to me it's quite dated. It maybe didn't quite deserve that award back then, but I remember when it did win, it was a very welcome one on that night, and people seemed pretty excited about Shrek taking that home. I'm also really interested to know about this controversy at the Annies when Kung Fu Panda won over Wall-E. To me, Wall-E is one of the best animated films of all time, in my opinion. And in retrospect, that doesn't, no disrespect to Kung Fu Panda. That's a great movie as well, by the way. But I just feel like, was that the right choice? I'm not sure.
Yeah. Yeah, to this day, if you ask different people in the industry, you're going to get polarizing answers. Some people will tell you that the Annie, you see, at the time, pretty much anyone could buy membership to ASIFA Hollywood to vote for the Annies, and many believe that it was stacked with DreamWorks members, and that's why it won. While others argue that Ollie was sweeping that year, and a lot of animators felt that while Wall-E was the better film overall, they thought Kung Fu Panda was the better cartoon. And I've talked to some people at Disney who claim that they actually knew people from that branch who did vote for Kung Fu Panda at the Annie Awards. And I also talked to one employee who was, I think it was either a former employee at Pixar who had since gone on to work at DreamWorks, or maybe it was the other way around, but she felt very awkward that night, just kind of being stuck in the middle of the room. Although, yeah, you can definitely see why that sparked backlash and why ASIFA needed to take things in a new direction with their leadership. And I get more into that in Volume 3, which is going to be published in early 2026.
Nice. Before I move on to volume three, I'm curious about not only are we talking about Oscars here, animation these days is absolutely so pivotal to what we see on the small screen, on streaming, on cable, on even network television, all the way back to The Simpsons. And of course, Seth MacFarlane's shows like Family Guy, American Dad, and then of course South Park, which right now is really hitting it out of the park in its attempt to, I assume, protest or make fun of or mock the current administration in Washington. So talk me through the Emmys and television and how important that has been for animation and its development as part of our pop culture.
Yeah, Volume 2 is really where we get more into the Emmy Awards. In Volume 1, we talk about some of the earlier shows that contended there, like the Flintstones, Hanna-Barbera. But Volume 2 is where we get into more 90s shows, like you said, South Park, Simpsons, Family Guy, as well as shows from Nickelodeon, shows from the WB like Animaniacs. There's a deep dive into Cartoon Network, and we take it by a case basis, exploring how The Simpsons was largely dominant in that category during the 90s, although even they kind of felt like a big fish in a small pond because they tried for years to get into the comedy series race. They were rejected, and when they were finally given permission to submit there, they still couldn't get nominated, and yet they nominated Mad About You, and really, all these years later, who talks about Mad About You? Not many people, but we still constantly quote The Simpsons. But they acknowledged that, yeah, we went back to the animation category after that and never looked back. But Family Guy would eventually get in there, and there's a deep dive into that and how that transpired. And you mentioned South Park, which could very well be a Best Animated Program contender this year, although I think if they were ever going to submit for the comedy series category, this would be the year to do it. If only because I think that a lot of Emmy members would be on board with them trolling Trump the entire season. So who knows? Maybe that could happen if they actually did campaign for it, but they probably won't. But
Uh,
yeah, that's where we mainly get into the Emmy Awards. And there's even more talk about the Emmys, like shows from like the past 10 years or so in Volume 3. Although, really,
I
when you think
would.
about it, a lot of the shows from the 90s are still airing today anyway.
That's right. They'll never die. I want to do a little deep dive actually right now if we can. That's a deep cut about Family Guy. A lot of people probably don't recall that it made it into the comedy series categories because they and I correct me if I'm wrong, but they made a conscious decision to not compete in animation, compete in comedy because that's where they felt they belonged, particularly for writing. And I was so excited about this because I was one of those people who was advocating for animation on television to be being just as important as live action when it comes to comedy, and they did it. Can you talk us through that because it's really interesting that it happened, and it kind of really hasn't happened again, I don't think.
Yeah, well, Family Guy did it at a very, very, specific time because three things contributed to that. At least three things. One was that it was around the same time that they extended the number of comedy series nominees. There could be up to like seven, and that's about how much there were that year, I believe. And it was also coming off of a writer's strike, so there were fewer shows in contention, especially newer shows. This was also the same year that shows like How I Met Your Mother and Weeds got in after being overlooked in the past. But it also really helped. That was a blue panel year. And for those who don't understand what a blue panel is, it was a special system under the Emmys where instead of the entire voting body deciding what's going to get nominated, it only came down to a select few people deciding what the nominees were going to be. So with a smaller voting body, it really helped Family Guy get in that particular year. And it ultimately lost to 30 Rock, which everyone was expecting, but they continued to try to get into comedy series in the years that followed, but it never materialized. And I think for one reason was because the following year, I mentioned that there was the writer's strike, so there weren't as many contenders. But by that following year, you had Modern Family, you had Glee, you had all these new shows coming in, so there just wasn't as much room for Family Guy. And eventually, the blue panels system would go away. And it also didn't help that Family Guy, it's still a lot of fun, but it was starting to go downhill at that point in time, according to many fans, which is kind of customary for any show. And it's a shame because I actually think that had Family Guy gone back to animated program, they could have won for the Road to Multiverse episode that they did, which a lot of people consider the best one they ever, put out. So they could have won an animated program for that. And they also maybe could have won for Road to the North Pole, which was also released around the same time they were trying to get back into comedy series. And by the time they did go back to comedy series, sorry, by the time they did go back to animated program, they just couldn't break back in. And now it's just an ongoing joke that they've never won an Emmy, even though they technically have in other categories. Seth MacFarlane has a ton of Emmys on his mantle, just not for the one you would expect. And it's weird because up until Family Guy, the only other animated show to get nominated as a comedy series was The Flintstones, which also never won in an animated program race. They didn't have that category back then. But even when they did finally introduce it, something like the Flintstones Christmas, which was a more modern special, couldn't win there. So it's ironic that those two shows were never able to win in the animation category.
It is very ironic. Like the two heavy hitters, apart from The Simpsons, and they were not able to do it. But yeah, I'll never forget Family Guy making it in, and of course the blue panels. I completely forgot about that. I think that was a year that like Christopher Maloney and a few of the other kind of outliers were nominated, and I think that's really exciting. I love it when the Emmys mix it up. These days, it's a bit more of a popularity contest, and you'll get a category full of The Last of Us and The White Lotus, and that'll be it. So we're in a different era now. Volume three is coming out soon, as you say, next year, and you start with Up getting into Best Picture, which again, when that happened, even though the Best Picture has been expanded, it's such an achievement for a film like Up to make it in. And by God, do I love that movie, particularly the first 10 minutes, like a lot of people say. So talk me through all the highlights that we can expect for Volume 3 when it does come out in the new year.
Yeah, well, like you said, it'll open with Up and how that got into Best Picture, and how at that point it was kind of embarrassing for the Academy that a Pixar film had never been nominated. Year after year, we're saying Pixar has the best film of this year, so why isn't it up there? And after Ratatouille and Wall-E especially, they finally did it, and they managed to follow that up with Toy Story 3, which gave a lot of people hope that we would finally see more in the future, but we haven't since then, and the book gets into why that hasn't happened, and part of it's because we haven't quite had a studio that's had a hot streak like Pixar did at that particular time. I think that's also one of the reasons why Beauty and the Beast got nominated, because it was coming off just at the dawn of the Disney Renaissance. They had come out with Roger Rabbit, which a lot of people felt should have been in Best Picture. There was The Little Mermaid, which was another huge hit, but didn't get into Best Picture. So by the time you got to Beauty and the Beast, they were like, there's enough goodwill built up here where we feel that you really deserve it. And Pixar had that like no other studio has. And to be fair, it is incredibly hard to come out with a string of hits to the point that the Academy says, we have to recognize you. It just doesn't really happen with many studios, which goes to show that animation has to work twice as hard as most, other mediums to get recognition. Although when you think about it, animation still has more nominations in Best Picture than something like documentary. And we
Right.
have been seeing more international films break into Best Picture. We've gotten to the point where more than two get in there, which gives me hope that maybe someday we'll see at least one or maybe even two animated films in the Best Picture race, but that doesn't seem to be happening anytime soon. And in addition to discussing animation highlights at the Oscars, we get more into Emmy shows like Emmy winners like Rick and Morty, as well as Emmy losers like BoJack Horseman, and I say that with great affection because BoJack really deserved to win more Emmys, as someone like Charles Bright will tell you at Gold Derby. And I interviewed him for the show too, for the book too, so expect a few quotes from him. Yeah. And we also get into the regime change at the Annie Awards and how they went through a change of leadership to because there was also that year that Disney boycotted and How to Train Your Dragon wound up swooping that year. And at that point, Asifa knew that they needed to take things in a new direction. And the book gets into how they made some leadership changes, they got back on good terms, and how you're never going to entirely satisfy anyone when it comes to award shows because just remember that there are always going to be people that say that your award show is rigged, whether it's the Oscars, the Emmys, but really, many of them are trying their hardest to make it as fair as possible, and that's what the Annies did.
Yeah. So this volume will end, I guess, with Flow winning Best Animated Feature. This obscure, I think it was Latvian, Lithuanian, one of the Baltic states. Beautiful movie, but I wasn't even predicting it. I thought, no, no, surely not. And it did when it won. So you're going to end it with that. My question is, what happens going forward? Will you ever decide to go back to the well and maybe give us like a an epilogue or another volume in 10 years' time?
Well, it's funny. When I first reached out to Bear Manor Media, it was the year that The Boy and the Heron won. So the book was pretty much done there. It still needed some polishing, but that had won. I was like, okay, that'll be a good place to end the story. And then that race happened with Flo beating big heavy hitters like the Wild Robot. And I was all like, well, do I want to do like an epilogue at the very end, getting into that race. And after Flow ultimately won, I was like, yeah, I better make that part of the third volume, especially since we're pushing back its release anyway. So I ended up writing that. And as for going back, I do think that there will always be material to write about in a fourth volume this year. Who knows what's going to happen, but we could very well see K-pop Demon Hunters win. We could see another smaller European film win like Arco or Little Amelie. We could even see maybe another sequel like Zootopia win. And it's going to be a very interesting Oscar race this year. And until I do get around to maybe writing a fourth volume, I am going to be covering the awards races on animation, all things animation, at my website, cartooncontender.com, where you can also learn more about the book there too.
Let's talk about K-pop Demon Hunters, shall we? Because if you had told me a year ago, there's this film that's K-pop, and it was flailing in development, in distribution, pardon me, and then Netflix took it on board, and now it's just an absolute monster hit. And Golden, the highlight song from that soundtrack, is a certified iconic Billboard smash all over the world. Every kid that I know is obsessed, like they used to be with Frozen back when my kids were that little. And I'm fascinated by this because firstly, I think the film is wonderful. I think the songs are great. And I want to see it win because I love the idea of K-pop. You know, Korean pop culture is expanding throughout the world, and I find it's so beloved by so many people that I would love to see this film really make an impact at the Oscars next year. What are your thoughts on K-pop Demon Hunters?
When I saw it, I had pretty much the same reaction as you. I immediately got on board with it. I asked, will an organization like the Academy embrace something like that? And after it started topping charts on Billboard and Netflix, I said, yes, this is absolutely getting nominated for Best Animated Feature. Even though a lot of people were also hesitant to get on board, I like to say that I was one of the first that said, yeah, this is definitely happening. And it's because people are excited about this movie, not just kids, not just adult fans of K-pop, but people in the animation industry as well. One of the reasons why we sometimes see sequels nominated at the Oscars in animation, but they usually don't win unless it's Toy Story, is because the Oscars want to embrace originality, and K-pop Demon Hunters is about as original as you can get. It's a completely original creation, and one from a major studio, which just doesn't really happen that much these days, especially one that feels like such a big swing. And it also, even though it was a streaming exclusive, it went to theaters for a week and then another, well, not even really a week, just a weekend. And really, even though it's not eligible for, actually, it might actually be eligible for the Box Office Achievement Award at the Golden Globes because I think they streaming into account too. It did have a Box Office Achievement that year, this year alone. It's one of the more fascinating stories, and I think that it could very well win. I'm not willing to say that quite yet because I want to see what happens at the Golden Globes, because we could very well see Arco or Little Amelie win there, and that's where we could see a changing of the tide, especially since K-pop Demon Hunters isn't eligible at the BAFTAs, which I think goes to show that Netflix really didn't have the foresight that this would be an awards contender. Otherwise, they would have guaranteed that it would have been eligible back in June. Fortunately, it's eligible at the Oscars, and I really don't know. Let's see. I do think that K-pop Demon Hunters, it'll probably win at Critics' Choice. It'll probably win at PGA. When we get to the Golden Globes, that's where we're going to see whether or not anything can really challenge it, because something different's going to win at BAFTA no matter what. And the critics' prizes could go all over the map. Maybe some of them will go for K-pop Demon Hunters. If we see an almost sweep like we did with Flow on the Critics' Awards, I might be a little iffy about it winning, but the question is, what are they going to go for there? Are they more likely to go to Arco or Little Amelie? Granted, at this time last year, we also weren't sure whether they'd go more for Flow or Memoir of a Snail on the indie front, but they clearly went with Flow. I could see there being more division between Arco and Little Amelie, because right now they seem almost equally beloved, although Little Amelie might have a slight edge. And I think the real question is, at this point, it feels like there are 4 pretty concrete potential nominees in that category. There's K-pop, there's Arco, Little Amelie, and Zootopia 2, which we're recording this on just before Thanksgiving here in the States. It hasn't, had a big theatrical, it hasn't, had its opening weekend yet, but be the, it's going to make $1 billion. Let's face it. By the time this
Yeah.
airs, it'll probably already made $1 billion. So that's getting there. The question is, what's the fifth nominee going to be? A lot of people have said Elio because they still believe that there's a Pixar mafia, which I don't really buy into. Yes, they have a voting block, but it's not like they get nominated every year. And I don't know if they're going to go for a film that, while was actually quite delightful, it just wasn't seen and had a lot of problems behind the scene. I think they're more like to go for In Your Dreams at Netflix, which actually is from a Pixar alumni with Alex Wu, and he has a lot of admirers in the industry. I think they might get on board with them. Although it would also be great to see something come out of left field. Like Netflix has a really great Korean animated film this year called Lost in Starlight, which has gone lost in the shuffle. And it'd be great to see that get some recognition, although it might not happen. And what could happen this year with anime? Could a film like Demon Slayer, the movie, get in there? Could Chainsaw Man? I don't know if there are enough admirers in the Academy of Anime, or at least enough that have caught up with those particular shows to be as invested. But we could see both of those shows show up at some predecessor awards. Like, I could imagine at the Golden Globes, we could see something like Demon Slayer, especially since there are 6 nominees there. So, yeah, and also G Kids, they've planted their flag with Little Amelie as their big animation contender, although I've heard great things about a movie called 100 Meters. Yeah, I believe that's the title, 100 Meters. I need to catch up with it myself, but pretty much everyone I know who's seen that movie loves it. The thing is, not a lot of people have seen it, and they haven't really been getting the buzz out about it, and maybe that could be the 5th nominee if only they had gone more buzz out, but who knows what could happen. I do think it is really unfortunate that the day the Earth blew up, a Looney Tunes movie wasn't submitted this year. It was submitted last year, where there was just too much competition for it to get any recognition. But maybe this year, if Catch Up Entertainment had held off on submitting it, it could have gotten just enough buzz to get that 5th spot. It definitely would deserve it in a year like this.
Yeah. I'm skeptical. I just don't know, firstly, how many demon-centered films are going to make it in the race. And then, of course, any film, I think the various awards groups, they like to pigeonhole, I think, sometimes. And it's like, well, we'll give this one to the Korean demon film, and then that will check off our demon quotient and our Asian quotient, and then we'll move on to Hollywood and other things. That's just how I sometimes see the race. But I would love to see these categories completely blown wide open and give us something really interesting, things that would never normally go out and watch. But of course, when you see the nominations, it's a really good way to get eyeballs onto these films, because it's obviously raises awareness and promotes, and that's the whole point of awards. Let's be honest. So yes, I'm very excited about the animated feature race this year for a change. Sometimes I kind of overlook it. I'm not really that fussed. This year, I'm really into it. So
Yeah.
finally, you mentioned cartooncontender.com. That's your website. And so you are covering awards and animation year round, where you can also order copies of the first 2 volumes of your book. So have you got any really interesting articles or coverage in the pipeline for the website that we can look out for?
Yes, absolutely. Right now, I'm interviewing a lot of people who have animated short contenders this year. Right now, there are over 100 pending animated shorts that have been submitted, and Volume 3 also
Kidding.
gets more. Yeah, and Volume 3 also gets more into the process of how you get eligible for an animated short to contend at the Oscars. You have to go through 3 routes. There's either win a Student Academy Award, win a major festival prize, or play in a commercial theater for a certain amount of times. We do a deep dive into that. But I've interviewed several filmmakers who have potential shorts in contention, and once the shortlet comes out, there will be 15 finalists, and from there will be 5 more. So we'll be covering that along with the animated feature race, and we'll also be doing breakdowns of all the other awards that'll be coming up in December, and how they differ from one another, all from an animations perspective, and also a deep dive into just whether or not K-pop Demon Hunters can go all the way. I've already written several articles about that, and it feels like there will be a lot more to talk about there.
Absolutely. Well, I will be keeping an eye on the website for sure. And everybody watching this, I've linked it down below on in this article. So please make sure you check it out. Nick, thank you so much for your time today. This is so fascinating. I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts or reading your thoughts once all these nominations actually start coming out. Who better to give us their perspective than someone like yourself who knows probably more than this stuff than anyone else that I've ever met?
Well, thank you for that, Rob. And you know a lot yourself about all things, awards related.